The morning sun over the English Channel had only just begun to lift the haze from the sky when the first glint of metal appeared far to the southeast, tiny flashes of reflected light flickering above the horizon like distant stars. At first, they seemed harmless, little more than faint specks shimmering in the pale August air. But within minutes those specks multiplied, stretched, and merged into long, dark formations moving with the steady, mechanical rhythm of engines humming in unison. It was August 16th, 1942, and German bombers were crossing the Channel again. Only this time, they were coming in numbers so large that their shadows spread over the water in overlapping patches, as if the sea itself were darkening under their approach. The coast beneath them remained quiet for the moment. Small fishing boats rocked gently in the tide. Seagulls wheeled above white cliffs that glowed under the sun's early light. Villages slept in the soft calm of another wartime morning, unaware that the sky above was changing. But on the airfields of southeast England, the calm had already shattered. The drone of engines, deep, resonant, unmistakable, rolled across the farmland like an approaching storm. RAF ground crews looked up instinctively, already knowing what such a sound meant. This was no reconnaissance flight. This was no probing raid. This was a massed daylight assault, the kind Germany rarely attempted anymore. At RAF Manston, airmen sprinted across the tarmac toward their Spitfires, their boots striking the concrete in rapid, echoing rhythms. Mechanics tightened harness buckles, slammed engine panels shut, and shouted final checks with grim urgency. The smell of aviation fuel hung in the air, mixing with the scent of damp grass and hot metal. The engines of the waiting fighters were already warming, their propellers spinning in slow, powerful circles that whipped dust into swirling columns. The pilots, still fastening gloves and oxygen lines, slid into their cockpits with quiet, practiced movements. Their faces, smeared with sweat and dirt, showed no panic, only the hard concentration of men who had fought too many battles to waste time on fear. Among them was Flight Lieutenant James Caldwell, a veteran of the earlier months of the war whose Spitfire Mk Vb had become as familiar to him as the room he slept in. His fingers brushed instinctively across the throttle and trim as he settled into the seat, the canvas straps closing tightly around his chest. The vibrations of the Merlin engine beneath him felt like the steady heartbeat of a living thing. He glanced once at the eastern sky, saw the distant smudge of aircraft approaching, and felt the old tension tighten in his stomach. Not dread, but the weight of recognition. He had seen raids before. He had survived the worst days of 1940. But nothing in the skies of the past 2 years resembled the scale gathering above the Channel now. The German formation grew larger by the second. Hundreds of aircraft stretched in layered tiers, their engines merging into a single low-frequency hum that vibrated through the air like the resonance of a massive machine. Junkers Ju-88s formed the backbone of the force, their long wings and twin engines cutting clean silhouettes against the sky. Dornier Du-217s followed behind, heavier and broader. And above them, circling like wolves guarding the pack, were the fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, flying in tight swarms, their silver fuselages catching the sunlight in sharp, hostile flashes. RAF radar stations had tracked the raid long before it appeared over the horizon. Operations rooms across the region buzzed with urgency. Controllers marked the German trajectories on large plotting tables with magnetized counters, pushing them steadily inland with wooden rods as the reports grew more detailed. Observers on the coast sent confirmation messages. Telephone lines crackled with overlapping voices. The scale of the attack was unlike anything seen in many months. Germany had gathered nearly every available bomber group in northern France, assembling them into a single massive daylight strike intended to break British morale and cripple several key industrial sites. What German planners did not know was that the RAF Squadron station closest to the projected interception point, Number 92 Squadron, had been resting, rearming, and rotating pilots for days in anticipation of a renewed offensive. Their Spitfires were tuned to peak performance. Their ground crews had worked through nights to ensure the fighters operated flawlessly. And their pilots, though weary from years of war, carried the hard-earned discipline of men forged in the crucible of the Battle of Britain. When the scramble order came, their engines roared as one. The Spitfires accelerated along the runway, wheels bouncing once before lifting into the cool morning air. One after another, they climbed sharply toward the forming contrail lines drifting high above the channel. Caldwell's aircraft shook as it gained altitude, the pressure against the canopy increasing, the engine screaming with rising intensity. He steadied his breath as he entered the haze of upper air, where the wind grew thin and the horizon blurred into pale streaks of white and blue. Higher and higher they climbed, forming a layered arc across the sky. Below them, the German formation continued its relentless march forward, confident in its numerical superiority. The bomber crews inside their glass-nosed cockpits scanned the horizon, expecting resistance but not fearing it. Their escort fighters flew above and ahead, ready to pounce on any RAF interceptors that dared approach. Experience had taught the Luftwaffe that daylight raids were risky. Losses could be severe. But with such numbers, and with the element of surprise, they believed the RAF would be overwhelmed before it could mount a coordinated defense. Yet what awaited them was not confusion or delay, but a single squadron whose pilots had endured the worst aerial storms of the war and emerged sharper, faster, and more relentless than ever. As Caldwell leveled off at altitude, the first shadows of the German raiders emerged through the thin cloud cover, dark shapes against the pale sky, growing larger with each passing moment. The bomber formations stretched across miles of airspace, tiered in tight, disciplined lines. Their engines roared like a giant machine grinding steadily toward its target. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The air thinned. The temperature dropped. Frost formed on the edges of the canopy. Caldwell tightened his grip on the control column as a Spitfire cut through the freezing air. This was the moment before impact, the last calm breath before chaos descended. The largest daylight raid Germany had launched in years was now crossing into British airspace, and a single RAF squadron was rising to meet it. The scale of the German formation moving across the channel did not arise from impulse or desperation. It was the culmination of months of reassessment within the Luftwaffe's high command, a deliberate attempt to reassert dominance in skies that had once seemed firmly under German control. After suffering heavy losses in 1940, Germany had avoided major daylight raids, favoring night attacks and smaller, targeted strikes. But by mid-1942, the strategic situation had begun to shift. The Soviet Union's resilience on the Eastern Front demanded more aircraft than Germany could easily provide. North Africa drained resources. U-boats consumed an enormous share of production. Yet despite these pressures, the Luftwaffe believed it could still deliver a symbolic and devastating blow against Britain if it concentrated its remaining bomber strength into one decisive, overwhelming daylight operation. This belief set the stage for what would become the largest coordinated bomber raid since the early days of the war. British intelligence had sensed something changing weeks before the raid. Signals monitoring, reconnaissance photographs from PRU Spitfires, and intercepted communications suggested that German bomber groups in northern France were being reorganized, reinforced, and drilled. Aircraft were repainted, engines overhauled, flight crews rotated. Luftwaffe technicians worked day and night on long rows of Ju-88s and Du-217s lined wingtip to wingtip at airfields in Abbeville, Saint-Omer, and Amiens. These preparations did not go unnoticed, but their final purpose remained unclear. Some believed Germany was preparing to shift bombers east. Others suspected a blow against coastal convoys. Only a minority within British command considered the possibility that the Luftwaffe might attempt another massive daylight strike. Such a strike would be costly. German bomber crews knew this. Many had flown the missions of 1940, had watched the sky fill with twisting Spitfires and hurricanes that tore through their formations. They had seen comrades fall, yet the orders came regardless. The Reich wanted a demonstration of strength, something that could shake British industry, disrupt production, and remind the world that Germany could still mount offensives far from the front lines. With the Eastern Front locked in a grinding struggle, the Mediterranean in flux, and the Atlantic campaign under increasing pressure, the leadership sought an action that could tilt the strategic narrative back in their favor. They chose a target deep inside Britain's industrial heart, knowing that a successful strike would reverberate across the entire war. British defenses, however, were no longer the thin, desperate network they had been in 1940. Radar coverage had expanded across the coast, forming a chain of detection that captured even small disturbances over the water. Observer Corps units drilled constantly, reporting aircraft types, directions, and estimated altitudes with remarkable accuracy. The RAF had refined its command and control structure into a rapid response system unmatched anywhere in the world. Fighter Command's operations rooms had become the beating heart of the air defense network, where trained plotters transformed incoming data into a real-time map of the sky. Controllers could move squadrons like chess pieces, guiding them to exact points where interception would be most effective. This system, refined through accumulated experience, meant that Britain would no longer be surprised by large formations. But knowing a raid is coming is not the same as stopping it. And despite intelligence clues, the precise scale of the approaching formation exceeded all expectations. As fighter controllers at Uxbridge studied the incoming paths, the counters on the plotting table began to multiply at an alarming rate. What first appeared as a probing strike soon revealed itself as a dense and layered offensive, with bombers arranged in staggered formations designed to overload defensive interceptions. The Luftwaffe's fighters, flying above them, numbered in the dozens. The largest daylight attack of its kind since the previous year was already over the channel, closing the distance with relentless momentum. The stakes were enormous. The target, though known only to the upper levels of RAF command, was a major industrial complex vital for aircraft production. Its destruction would reduce Britain's ability to reinforce its air power in the coming months. The factories being targeted employed thousands and produced critical components for the very fighters now climbing to intercept the bombers. A single strike might cripple assembly lines for weeks or months. German planners intended exactly that, to tear into the lifeline of British military aviation, undermine morale, and demonstrate that daylight raids were still viable. Against this immense force, only one RAF squadron was positioned to intercept in time. The others were too distant, too low on fuel, or scrambled too late to arrive before the bombers reached their inland attack route. Number 92 Squadron, experienced, aggressive, and recently rotated for rest, was the only unit within reach of the required altitude and bearing. Their responsibility became greater than any single squadron should have been expected to bear. The pilots knew none of this detail as they climbed. They knew only the sound of their engines, the cold of the upper air, and the distant glimmer of enemy formations ahead. They did not yet see the scale of what they were flying into. They understood the general pattern of Luftwaffe operations, but the sheer number of aircraft now crossing the channel defied the usual logic of German air strategy. Yet even when the shadows thickened and the sky ahead grew darker with approaching bombers, the pilots maintained their climb without hesitation. Experience had taught them that altitude was life, position was everything, and delay was death. Below them, the channel stretched in a long, rippling sheet of pale blue. Above them, Contrails drifted like ribbons pulled thin by the cold. The landscape below remained deceptively peaceful. Coastlines, fields, villages, all quiet beneath the rising sun. Yet the quiet belied the storm descending from the east. German bomber crews sat in tightly packed cockpits, each man performing his duties with mechanical precision. Navigators traced lines on their charts, adjusting headings with small corrections. Bomb aimers prepared their equipment, peering through glass nose cones to track the coastline ahead. Pilots maintained formation, holding tight intervals that kept the vast assault tightly coordinated. Their escort fighters, flying above and ahead, remained alert for the first glimpse of the enemy. Germany believed its numerical advantage would guarantee success. But numbers alone do not dictate outcomes in the sky. Position matters. Timing matters. Clarity of purpose matters. And the RAF pilots of No. 92 Squadron carried a resolve shaped by the hardest early months of the war, a resolve that turned experience into instinct. The bomber crews expected resistance, but not devastation. The fighter escorts expected combat, but not an interception of such ferocity that the first clash would reshape the entire raid. What they could not see was that No. 92 Squadron had achieved something rare. They had climbed to the perfect altitude at the perfect moment, arriving on the enemy's flank just as the formation began its inland turn. In the world of aerial warfare, this was the difference between disruption and annihilation. As the distance closed, Caldwell scanned the mass of aircraft ahead, recognizing instantly the bomber types, the defensive arcs of their machine guns, the escort altitudes, the weaknesses of their formation. The sun caught the frames of the bombers, turning their metal into brief flashes of silver. Their roar filled the air, vibrating through Caldwell's canopy, through his seat, through the bones of his hands. This was not merely a raid. It was a statement, a challenge in the sky. And No. 92 Squadron, alone in its path, was about to answer it. The gap between the RAF Squadron and the German formation closed rapidly as both sides pressed toward their respective objectives. The Germans moved inland with unwavering cohesion, unaware that the geography of the sky was beginning to tilt against them. The British pilots, having reached optimal altitude, shifted subtly into a sweeping arc that placed them not directly ahead of the massive bomber stream, but high on its flank, where angles favored surprise over direct confrontation. It was a position that emerged not through luck, but through years of combat intuition. The men of No. 92 Squadron had experienced every kind of aerial engagement the war could offer, from the swirling chaos of the Battle of Britain to the grinding attrition of small coastal raids. They recognized the distinct rhythm of the sky when a large force approached, understood how shadows and sunlight shaped visibility, and sensed when timing aligned in their favor. From their vantage point, the RAF pilots could now see the scale of the enemy. The bomber formations stretched across miles, layered waves of machine and metal, each following the one before it in perfect geometric patterns. Engines throbbed in synchronized unison, sending vibrations through the thin air that could be felt even at distance. Lines of condensation trailed behind them, drawing pale scars across the sky that intersected and scattered with the shifting winds. Above and slightly ahead, the Luftwaffe escorts flew in dense formations of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, their movement tighter and more agile than the lumbering bombers below. They scanned the sky with expectation, confident that their numerical superiority would allow them to control the engagement once British fighters appeared. Yet they had not anticipated that the first British attackers would emerge from a position nearly parallel to the bomber stream. This angle minimized the visibility of the Spitfires until the final moments before contact. Light refracted differently across the upper atmosphere, and the sun, now rising behind the RAF Squadron, cast them as faint shapes rather than distinct aircraft. Their camouflage, matched to the pale gray-blue of the northern sky, blurred into the background. Even the thin vapor of their wake dissipated quickly in the cold air. They were ghosts moving into position, unseen but perfectly aligned. German bomber crews continued their inward sweep, unaware of how exposed they were. Their gun emplacements, mounted in dorsal, ventral, and tail positions, were designed to repel head-on and rear attacks. The flanks, while protected, were more vulnerable. The aircraft relied heavily on escort fighters to guard these angles. But with the RAF Squadron entering from above and behind the left flank of the bomber stream, the geometry shifted. The escorts were positioned too far ahead to respond instantly. Their alignment assumed a frontal threat, not a high-angle lateral strike. Caldwell and his pilots leveled their formation just outside of the bomber's defensive perimeter. The hum of Merlin engines filled the cockpits with a deep, steady vibration. Frost clung to the edges of canopies. Oxygen masks carried the taste of cold metal and rubber. Each man focused narrowly on his instruments, his gun sight, and the shifting shapes in the distance that signaled the transition from preparation to combat. They were waiting for a moment that every experienced fighter pilot understood instinctively. A moment when an attacking formation transforms from a line of aircraft into a single, coordinated spear. That moment arrived when the German bombers began their inland turn. As the lead formations shifted slightly northwest, altering their bearing toward the designated industrial region, the long columns of aircraft rolled gently in unison, exposing the upper left quadrants of their fuselages to the sky above. In that roll, small windows of vulnerability appeared, brief, fleeting, but significant. The British pilots recognized the opportunity immediately. Years of training had taught them how to interpret such movements, how to sense when formations were committed and unable to maneuver freely. The inland turn locked the German bombers into a predictable trajectory, leaving them less able to adjust range or angle as fighters swept in. The Spitfires accelerated as one. The engines, pushed into full power, unleashed a rising howl that cut through the cold air. Caldwell lowered the nose of his aircraft just enough to gain speed. The gap narrowed with breathtaking speed. The bomber silhouettes filled the canopy, no longer abstract shapes, but clear images of glass nose cones, rotating propeller discs, and the dark ovals of engine cowlings. Gun blisters protruded from their fuselages. Thin lines of exhaust trailed behind them. They were no longer distant machines. They were targets. The first phase of the engagement unfolded with a suddenness that defied the long, tense minutes leading to it. The RAF formation plunged into the bomber stream from above, engaging at angles rarely exploited by fighters facing large formations. They aimed for weak points, the dorsal arcs, the spaces between waves, the precise area where escort coverage was thinnest. Caldwell angled downward toward a Ju-88 at the rear of the first wave. The bomber swelled in size, its camouflage patterns sharpening into distinct mottled patches. The dorsal gunner rotated his turret in confusion, the angle too steep to track effectively. It was a vulnerability built into the aircraft's design, one the RAF had learned to exploit through bitter experience. The squadron struck with precision. Spitfires descended like arrows, their wings cutting the thin upper air with sharp, controlled bank angles. The bomber crews, stunned by the suddenness of the appearance, attempted to return fire, but their defensive arcs could not cover the steep vector of approach. The gunners aimed wildly, firing bursts that vanished into empty sky. For the German escorts, the attack was a shock. From their forward positions, they needed precious seconds to reposition, to break formation, to dive back toward the bombers they were meant to protect. But aerial combat is measured in moments, not minutes. The smallest delay can open gaps wider than any physical distance. As the escorts pivoted, some too steeply, others too shallow, their coordinated patterns scattered. The Spitfires had already reached the heart of the bomber stream. The impact was immediate. The sudden loss of cohesion among the German fighters created openings across the upper airspace. Spitfires swept through these openings with practiced agility, climbing and diving in controlled arcs that made them difficult to track. The bombers, heavily laden and slow to react, struggled to maintain formation under the stress of the assault. Aircraft drifted out of alignment, gaps widened, and turbulence rippled across the formation as pilots attempted to restore order. The Luftwaffe had wagered on the strength of its numbers. But aerial warfare rarely rewards numbers alone. It rewards positioning, initiative, and the ability to impose uncertainty on an opponent whose strategy depends on cohesion. The RAF Squadron, small though it was, had achieved precisely that. They had thrown doubt into a system that required clarity. The moment the bomber formations lost their harmony, the nature of the engagement changed. No longer did the Germans advance as a single, unified mass. They became clusters of aircraft struggling to avoid one another, while simultaneously fending off attacks from above. The Spitfires exploited every opening that appeared. They maneuvered between drifting bombers, ducked beneath wings, and climbed steeply into the sunlit air to re-engage from new angles. Their synchronized attacks shattered the illusion of invulnerability that the German crews had carried into the raid. The German pilots, attempting to regain control, pushed their aircraft into steep dives, trying to create space between themselves and the interceptors. Some escorts, flying FW-190s, attempted to pull the Spitfires away by engaging them aggressively from above. But even these tactics faltered when confronted by the chaotic movement of the bombers beneath them. Every dive to intercept risked colliding with the aircraft they were trying to protect. The sky, once a structured battlefield, had become a crowded and unpredictable arena filled with intersecting trajectories, bursts of tracer fire, and a violent turbulence created by hundreds of engines. As the conflict intensified, the Spitfire's advantage grew. They fought with clarity and purpose, anchored in their shared mission to break the raid before it reached its target. The German bomber crews, by contrast, fought with rising desperation. Every evasive maneuver threatened to break formation further. Every attempt to climb or dive disrupted the stability needed for a precise bombing run. The raid depended on timing, on synchronized altitude, speed, and bearing. And No. 92 Squadron was dismantling that synchronization one aircraft at a time. Through the conflict and the chaos, a single truth emerged with brutal clarity. Positioning had become fate. The RAF Squadron, aligned perfectly at the moment of contact, now controlled the rhythm of the battle. And the German pilots, shocked by how quickly their massive formation had been thrown into disarray, were beginning to understand that numbers alone could not protect them from a squadron that had mastered the geometry of the sky. The climax of the battle arrived with a force and suddenness that eclipsed even the aggressive opening moments. What had begun as a coordinated interception turned quickly into a brutal test of endurance and precision in a sky crowded with machines struggling to retain order. The vast German raid, built around the confidence of numbers and the assumption of overwhelming force, now fractured under the relentless strikes of a single RAF squadron whose timing had been nothing short of perfect. The once steady hum of synchronized engines dissolved into a chaotic soundscape of strained motors, abrupt altitude changes, and the sharp clatter of machine gun bursts erupting across multiple layers of air. As the bomber formations continued their slow, predetermined flight path inland, gaps widened rapidly between aircraft that had once flown wingtip to wingtip. Some began to drift out of alignment, their pilots fighting against turbulence created by the violent maneuvers forced upon them. Thin contrails that had once drawn clean, straight lines across the sky now twisted into erratic spirals as bombers attempted to correct altitude and heading. The Germans' intended attack route deteriorated into clusters of machines struggling to keep pace with one another, their once cohesive structure unraveling thread by thread. Caldwell dove sharply between two Ju-88s that had separated from the mainstream. The aircraft loomed large in his canopy, their wing shadows flickering across his Spitfire's fuselage as he slipped between them with narrow margins of safety. The dorsal gunner of one bomber strained to follow him with his weapon, but could not bring the gun to bear at the necessary angle. The geometry was impossible. Caldwell's aircraft rolled beneath the bomber, cutting through its blind spot, and climbed into the sunlit air above. The moment he regained visual clarity, he saw the broader battlefield in stark, sprawling detail. Bombers drifting apart, escorts diving in desperate attempts to regain control, plumes of smoke rising from engines struck in the first wave of attacks. Above the confusion, the German escorts attempted to impose structure on the chaos. Bf-109s dove from higher altitude, engines shrieking as they cut through pockets of cold, thin air. FW-190s followed, their heavier frames shaking as they passed through turbulent wakes left by the bombers. Their goal was simple: to break the attack, to fend off the Spitfires long enough for the bomber stream to regain altitude discipline and hold its bearing. But every second spent repositioning cost them the advantage of altitude and allowed the RAF fighters to maneuver unpredictably. The escorts' dives, meant to intimidate, often forced them directly into the narrow, crowded spaces between the bombers where coordinated flight became almost impossible. Meanwhile, the Spitfires of No. 92 Squadron exploited every inch of the sky with ruthless efficiency. The pilots used their tighter turn radius, superior climb rate, and experience in massed engagements to outmaneuver the escorts at every turn. They rolled through gaps in the formation, climbed steeply to re-enter from above, dove into blind spots where gunners struggled to respond, and accelerated past defensive arcs that had been carefully calibrated for frontal and rear attacks, not for steep, angled strikes from high lateral positions. The squadron's cohesion under pressure was extraordinary. Years of combat had forged their patterns of movement. They anticipated one another's intentions without a word, weaving their aircraft into a coordinated dance that remained fluid even as the sky dissolved into an unpredictable storm of fire and steel. Below the escort battle, the German bombers suffered the consequences of every disruption. One Ju-88, attempting to maintain the pre-planned altitude, drifted slightly lower. Its pilot, unable to keep formation due to turbulence and evasive maneuvers, unintentionally exposed the formation's underbelly. Caldwell and another RAF pilot identified the opening instantly. They descended on the trailing bomber from above and behind its left quarter, a position nearly impossible for the dorsal gunner to cover. The Ju-88 lurched as its defensive guns fired blindly into empty space, tracers streaking harmlessly into the cold air. The Spitfire's wings shuddered as it unleashed a burst that cut across the bomber's engine nacelle. Flames erupted from the cowling. Oil sprayed into the slipstream. The bomber began a slow, spiraling descent, trailing smoke behind it like a dark banner marking its fall. The loss of even a few bombers shook the confidence of the entire formation. The German crews were trained professionals, but the psychological effect of seeing aircraft around them fall in rapid succession was undeniable. The sound of engines took on a different character, a strained, uneven noise that reflected the growing disorder. Pilots pulled away from one another to avoid collisions. Gunners fired at shadows, uncertain of the angles from which the attacks were coming. The internal cohesion that had allowed them to operate as a single, unified force now collapsed under the relentless pressure applied by the Spitfires. The RAF pilots pressed deeper into the formation, climbing and diving with an aggression that left the Luftwaffe escorts scrambling to keep pace. A cluster of Du-217s attempted to regain formation by tightening their spacing, but the sudden maneuver caused turbulence that rippled through the group. One bomber drifted too close to another, their wingtips slicing dangerously near. The minor collision forced both crews into abrupt corrections, further widening the gaps and destroying any semblance of order. The Luftwaffe depended on synchronicity for bombing accuracy. Without it, the mission's success faltered by the second. As the main body of escorts continued downward to engage, the higher altitude FW-190s attempted a counterattack. They dived toward the RAF formation with steep, aggressive angles, expecting to scatter the Spitfires. But the British pilots anticipated the move and broke their formation rapidly, splitting into pairs that veered left and right. The German fighters passed between these diverging arcs, losing the visual anchors they needed for effective pursuit. The Spitfires regrouped moments later in new positions, re-entering the bomber stream from fresh angles. Every escort attack dissolved into fragmented chases that pulled the German fighters further from the bombers they were meant to protect. Below, another wave of RAF strikes hit the central spine of the bomber formation. The layered structure of the raid, designed to absorb losses without losing its bombing path, now struggled to maintain any semblance of order. Bomb aimers, struggling to hold their calculated trajectories, saw the lines drift dangerously. Navigators argued with their instruments. Pilots compensated with increasingly frantic corrections. The entire intent of the raid, to deliver a concentrated strike on a vital industrial target, was unraveling in midair. The bombers that attempted to hold their course suffered worst of all. Their rigid formation became easy prey for the Spitfires. Caldwell swung around a second Ju-88 whose tail gunner, seeing him too late, fired wildly into the haze behind. The Spitfire banked sharply, climbing just above the bomber's arc before rolling into a downward strike. Caldwell aimed for the starboard engine. His aircraft shuddered violently as a burst of fire erupted from his wings. The Ju-88's engine exploded in a sudden flash, debris scattering into the air. The bomber pitched forward and fell, trailing smoke that twisted as it descended into the clouds below. The German escort commander attempted one last effort to regain order. Bf-109s spread into lateral screens, trying to create a defensive barrier between the Spitfires and the remaining bombers. But the effort was too late. The formation below had disintegrated into a patchwork of aircraft fleeing in multiple directions. Some climbed, others turned sharply. A few attempted to retreat toward the channel. The tight, disciplined geometry that had given the raid its power was now gone. In that moment, the magnitude of the disaster became fully apparent to the German pilots. Their large force, so carefully assembled, so heavily guarded, so dependent on cohesion, was being stripped apart by a single RAF squadron that fought with an intensity few had seen since the early days of the war. A massive daylight raid, intended to strike deep into British industry, had been halted before it even reached its target. The climax of the battle came not with a final explosion or a single decisive action, but with the realization that nothing remained of the raid's original structure. Every bomber that survived was fleeing. Every escort was consumed by the effort of protecting what little remained. The sky, once filled with ordered lines of machines, was now a drifting mass of smoke, debris, and scattered aircraft retreating toward the channel. The German pilots, shocked by the scale of the collapse, understood what had happened only in the final moments. The RAF had not simply intercepted them. They had dismantled the raid piece by piece, using precision, timing, and experience to break apart the largest daylight assault Germany had attempted in years. And as the remaining German aircraft fled toward the east, the sky over Britain belonged once again to a single RAF squadron that had stood alone and prevailed. The sky gradually fell silent in the hour after the German raid broke apart, the echoes of engines fading into the distance as scattered, damaged aircraft limped back toward the channel. The crisp August air, once thick with the roar of hundreds of machines, now hovered in an uneasy quiet that felt almost unreal after the chaos that had consumed the morning. Smoke trails drifted lazily from the clouds, dissolving slowly into the pale blue as the wind carried away the remnants of the battle. The earth below remained calm and unchanged, as if unaware that a confrontation of immense scale had just unfolded in the sky above it. For the pilots of No. 92 Squadron, the return to Earth came gradually, like descending through layers of tension that had built up during the engagement. Their fuel gauges had dropped dangerously low after extended climbs, dives, and repeated attack runs. Their engines ran hot, their wings bore streaks of grime and oil, and their guns, now nearly empty, carried the smell of burnt cordite. Each aircraft returned alone or in pairs, separated from the others by the chaotic maneuvers that had shattered the German formation. The airfield below grew larger as they descended, its runways cutting narrow, parallel lines across the green fields that bordered the coast. As the Spitfires touched down one by one, their wheels screeching lightly against the runway, ground crews rushed to meet them with a mixture of relief and restrained urgency. Mechanics signaled with gloved hands, guiding each plane to a halt as their engines sputtered and cooled. The smell of hot metal and exhaust hung across the tarmac in a heavy, lingering haze. Pilots opened their canopies slowly, their faces pale from adrenaline and exposure to the cold upper air. Some removed their oxygen masks with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the physical exertion of flying through the most intense aerial engagement many of them had ever experienced. Caldwell climbed from his aircraft with deliberate movements, his legs unsteady on the metal footholds. The Merlin engine behind him ticked as it cooled, each sound a sharp reminder of how close to its limits the machine had been pushed. His flight suit was streaked with grime and sweat. His gloves, stiff from the cold at altitude, felt heavy in his hands. As he stepped onto the tarmac, the reality of what they had accomplished began to take shape, though it remained hazy and surreal, like a distant memory emerging through fog. While the pilots regained their breath, RAF controllers received reports from coastal stations and radar outposts. The data was pieced together slowly, each message confirming what the pilots themselves could not fully see during the battle. The largest German daylight raid in months had been stopped before reaching its target. Not slowed, not disrupted, but utterly broken. The bombers had never approached the industrial complex that had been their objective. Instead, damaged and disorganized, they had turned back over the channel, many trailing smoke or losing altitude as they fled toward their bases in France. For the Luftwaffe, the aftermath was a grim tally of losses. Bombers failed to return. Some crashed into the sea. Others barely reached airfields, landing with burned engines or damaged control surfaces. Ground crews watched as aircraft limped across the runway, their fuselages riddled with holes or their landing gear collapsing under them. The scale of the failure spread from one base to another as reports compiled the missing aircraft, the wounded crew members, and the bomb aimers and navigators who would never return. Discussions in German command centers turned from confidence to confusion, then to shock. How could such a large, coordinated force be dismantled by a single RAF squadron? What had gone wrong in the calculations? The planning, the assumptions of superiority? The analysis that followed would attempt to explain the collapse. Unexpected angles of attack, unfavorable altitude, misaligned escort coverage. But beneath the technical explanations lay a deeper truth that German pilots understood even before the reports were filed. The RAF squadron had fought with a level of cohesion, timing, and precision that transformed the battlefield. It was not merely resistance. It was mastery of the geometry of air combat. In Britain, the news spread slowly but carried immense symbolic weight. Industrial workers who had been preparing for air raid alarms learned that the expected attack had never reached them. Factories continued their work unabated, the hum of machinery filling the spaces where silence might have reigned had the bombers arrived. The raid that could have crippled production had been stopped at its source. Newspapers would later write of the turning point in the air war, though the pilots who fought that morning considered such words too dramatic. To them, it had been another battle, fierce, costly, exhausting, but only one among many they had endured and would endure still. On the airfield, the mood remained subdued. Pilots sat on wooden crates, leaning against fuel drums or the wings of their aircraft. Their exhaustion muted any sense of triumph. Mechanics handed them mugs of tea as they waited for debriefings, the steam rising gently in the cool air. The sound of distant engines returning, some belonging to straggling Spitfires, others to reconnaissance aircraft sent to track the retreat, echoed across the field. The war was not over. The threat of another raid lingered. The pilots knew that the Luftwaffe would not simply abandon its objectives. They would gather strength, reorganize, and return. Yet for this one morning, the sky had held. As debriefings began, pilots recounted their impressions with careful precision. Altitudes, headings, formations, numbers, angles of attack. Intelligence officers recorded every detail to build a fuller picture of the engagement. The commanders who listened recognized the significance of what they heard. The RAF Squadron had not only intercepted the raid, they had disrupted it at a structural level, breaking the cohesion essential for a successful bombing run. The loss of altitude discipline, the widening formation gaps, the premature retreat. These were not mere tactical setbacks. They reflected a collapse that would burden German planning for months to come. Outside the operations rooms, the burnt smell of engine oil mixed with the scent of freshly cut grass. The airfield seemed almost peaceful, yet the skies above bore faint scars, thin trails of dissipating smoke, drifting toward the coastline like the fading echoes of a storm. The pilots watched the horizon in silence, each man processing the morning in his own way. Some replayed the engagement in their minds, examining every maneuver. Others allowed their thoughts to drift to the comrades who had returned and those who had not. The wind carried the coolness of the sea across the field. The Spitfires, their metal skins cooling in the shade of dispersal bays, stood silent and still. They had endured the most intense aerial pressure the squadron had faced in months. Their engines would require inspection, their guns rearming, their wings cleaning. Soon they would rise again, for the war demanded constant vigilance. But for the moment, the field remained quiet. The danger had passed, and the understanding settled in slowly, gradually, like the sun emerging from behind a cloud. A single RAF squadron had stopped what the Luftwaffe believed to be an unstoppable daylight offensive. In the days that followed, Germany would reconsider its daylight strategy. Crews would whisper about the disaster over the channel, about how Spitfires had appeared from impossible angles, about how the formation had dissolved before they could reach their target. Reports would list missing aircraft. Commanders would study maps. But the truth, simple and unchanging, would hover behind every analysis. A single squadron had broken the raid. A disciplined handful of pilots, flying machines built on British soil, had dismantled a force many times their size. Their resolve had shaped the outcome, and the sky, for that one decisive morning, had belonged to them completely. As the sun set that day, casting long shadows across the airfield, the last contrails disappeared into the deepening blue. What remained was a quiet certainty that would echo through the rest of the war. Sometimes, the turning points in history are not made by armies or fleets, but by a few men rising into the sky at the perfect moment. Men whose skill and resolve defy even the greatest forces set against them.